that really want to sign up and volunteer to do this work. And that's why we wanted to do this event, to hopefully inspire some of you to do just that. I'd like to welcome our principal panelists this evening, Mirtala Hernandez Augustin, who's a human rights defender from Guatemala, who's fighting for justice for victims of enforced disappearance in her country. And also Laura Rodriguez, who's an ex-PBI field volunteer, who recently worked in our Mexico team and is currently studying her master's in Indiana. The structure for tonight's event is that we're going to hear from the filmmakers who've joined us this evening. I'm very pleased to welcome them. We'll have an opportunity to watch the film, and then we'll have a question and answer session with our two principal panelists before we can open to your questions. If you have questions, please at any point use the button below that says Q&A, and you can type your question in there. The shorter the better, but you can ask anything at all, and Christina, my colleague, will group those questions so that we can answer them towards the end of the event. That's also when we'll talk about exactly how you can get involved with PBI and the opportunities that exist. So I think without further ado, we will welcome Charlotte Ginsborg and Helen Selka, who are the filmmakers. They're both independent filmmakers based in London who've made a number of documentaries and other films, as well as the short film that we're about to watch. We're really grateful for their work, and I'd now like to ask Helen to say a few words about their motivation and their experience in making the film.
Thanks, Ben. I think Ben has explained very clearly the mission of PBI, and I think I had made a film before called Invisible Mandelas. So when I was invited to do a workshop on the volunteer experience, I asked Charlotte to come along and collaborate with me because the work of PBI is really important and based on principles of peace. And as Ben said, any contact with PBI can be transformational, and transformation is a very interesting theme for a filmmaker. But catching how volunteers' lives have changed through working with PBI and through being inspired by the privilege of being able to accompany defenders was really enough motivation for any filmmaker. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen, and thanks again for all the work put into summing up in this short film what PBI is all about and the volunteer experience. So without further ado, let's watch it. You don't need to move channels. You stay in the channel that you're on in terms of the language that you've chosen. If you do have any issues watching the film through Zoom, the link to the film on YouTube has been put in the chat, so you can click through to it there if you have any trouble watching it through Zoom. But otherwise, let's watch In the Company of Hope.
There's something very powerful with volunteering. You do it because you're convinced of something, because you really want to do that.
I was 28 when I started traveling on my own. Before that, I was quite scared, but something happened in my life. I went through a relationship, it broke up, and I just found the strength. I thought, yes, I'm going to do this.
PBI struck me as something that it's literally a model built around your role as somebody from elsewhere supporting local struggles, as a foreigner, as somebody outside showing solidarity, wanting to support but without doing harm.
Volunteering is not a one-way process, it never is. One person on their own doesn't bring about change. It's when you come together and work together that change happens.
There is absolutely one person who I would say is probably the person who's changed my life more than anybody else. A human rights defender called Valentina Rosendo Cantu. When she was very young, was one of several Indigenous women who were raped by soldiers. What distinguishes her and her fellow Indigenous leader, Inez, is that they denounced the rapes. They reported them and they demanded justice. They were getting death threats. Their kids were getting death threats. Clearly somebody had the objective of silencing them. And amazingly, they kept going. Valentina and Inez took their cases to the Inter-American Court, and the Inter-American Court found the Mexican state guilty. That's an incredible example of how two women would not be silenced in standing up because they were raped. They were at the sharpest end of the abuses in Mexico. They struggled and fought in the face of such adversity, and they ultimately got a decision that could affect all Mexicans. And what is inspiring for all of us is that she says that having international and national level accompaniment allowed her to really build on that capacity and pull it out to the forefront and never give up.
My first week back in the UK, I decided to meet some ex-colleagues from PBI in London, and I'm crossing the bridge. First thing I do is I hear the helicopter, and I'm ducking. I need to find a place to hide. And that's when I felt the impact of, gosh, I'm not in Colombia anymore. A helicopter in Colombia is danger. A helicopter in Colombia is gunshots. If you live in fear, then you're not free. I had the choice to leave. People living there, they don't have the choice. In a way, I felt it allows us, as the international eye, to tell the story to the outside world, which is critical. Otherwise, who's going to listen? Who's going to know what's happening?
In this work, you sometimes face very dark moments and dark situations because there is terrible things that are happening to the people, and sometimes you can't do anything about it. But then there's also the lightness, the hope people have, the solutions, the joy of people. And that's, I think, what human rights defenders often bring with them. All of the experiences I had with PBI, but also with what I'm currently doing, you grow and learn constantly. And there's so much you can learn from other people. And I think it's about listening, really listening to what other people are saying, and not disempowering them and not thinking, I know what's best, but hearing from them, those who are affected by something, how they would like to find a solution, and supporting them in that.
It's about trying to make change, about seeing social justice come about supporting those who need a voice for their rights to be heard. It touched me on a different level, that it changed what was important for me in a way. That all of a sudden you begin to realise that a lot of petty things that you used to get annoyed and upset, and all of a sudden they didn't matter actually anymore. Seeing how people put life first, seeing how people believe in being really positive about how to go forward with things. Those core things that so many other things around them, really, they don't matter.
Fantastic. The thing about a webinar is that you can't have a round of applause, but I would applaud if we could do that together. And thanks again, Helen and Charlotte, for making that film, which I think is really impactful, and hopefully also gives everybody who's tuned in this evening a better sense of PBI's work, and especially, as you said, of the volunteer experience. I've no idea who that young fella in the film was. Let's start the question and answer session with Laura and Mirtala. And Mirtala, I'm really, really glad that you can join us. I'm very grateful that you can join us. I know what a difficult time it is in Guatemala at the moment, with the threats to democracy as well as the threats to human rights defenders. And so thank you for taking your time to join us this evening. My first question will be to you, and I'd like to ask if you can tell us a little bit about the human rights issues that you work on in Guatemala and what led you to seek the support of PBI.
Buenos días a todos. Yo les estoy hablando aquí desde Guatemala. Es muy importante para nosotros este acompañamiento que PBI en un momento de la historia guatemalteca surgió debido a los regímenes militares que crearon terror y temor en las familias guatemaltecas. Nuestra familia fue tocada debido a la desaparición forzada de mi hermana Luz Leticia Hernandez Augustin, quien el día de hoy está cumpliendo años.
It's many, many years since she was disappeared. So it was on this day in 82, so the 22nd of November 1982 that she was disappeared. And so we went to PBI in 83 or 84, I think, that PBI came to being. And my mother needed support. We needed help. And we asked PBI because my mum then was a member of a mutual support group during the armed conflict, and we wanted support to be able to get the remains of my family together. We've been seeking for her for 40 years, struggling for 40 years, but we still face the same problems. Why was my sister disappeared? The conditions in our country haven't improved. So the things that people were living through then continue now. It's changed. The repression was atrocious and so open then. But what they've done over this period of time is to continue using fear and terror to control the Guatemalan people. PBI has been a bastion. They have strengthened us. They've supported us. And this has meant that we can continue in our struggle. It has allowed us to continue to denounce the serious human rights violations that continue to occur against all human rights defenders in Guatemala for the fights relating to territory, misuse of water, violations of human rights, and attacks on people and their integrity for enforced disappearances. PBI has supported us all this time and have listened to us in all of the hardest, the darkest times through the terror that we lived through. And we're still standing because of them. And that's why. So thank you.
Thank you, Mirtala, and thanks even more so for having joined us on what is obviously such a symbolic and important date for you. I didn't know that until you said that. So special thanks for sharing your story and your family story on this date as well. And as you say, and I'm sure as you know, PBI is working with the families of the disappeared people in many, many countries, not only in Guatemala, but in Mexico, Colombia, Honduras, and elsewhere, and indeed in Indonesia and Nepal and other regions. Laura, you were a field volunteer in Mexico pretty recently, as I understand, last year and coming into this year. Can I ask you what motivated you to apply to volunteer with PBI?
Thank you, Ben, and thank you all for the invitation to be here. PBI for me, as you mentioned, was a very fulfilling experience and very transformative. So it's very special to share this with you today. And I knew that the work that PBI was doing in Colombia. That was my first approach to the organization. And mainly during my work in San Jose in Costa Rica, I was working with an organization that represents victims of human rights violations to the Inter-American human rights system. So working there, I like get involved with all the important roles that human rights defenders and civil society organizations were doing in the region, but also was very far away of the places where the people are. So after 2 years, I got like to know. I start thinking like that I was planning to, you know, work closely with the people and try to I was too interested to learn more, you know, and that is exactly what attract me to PBI, because as you already mentioned, the closeness which this work is the essential role that PBI do. So that is how I apply for volunteering at PBI and decide to go to Mexico. Yeah, basically because of that.
And how did that work in Mexico compare to those expectations? Can you describe a little bit more about what that work looked like and how it compared to your expectations before you went?
Well, the work in PBI is very diverse. I will say that for me was fulfilling, but also challenging at the same time, because normally we used to work from this perspective that you have in a specific role or in a specific, you know, like position in the organization, but you arrive then to PBI and you do very diverse tasks. You do a lot of things, but actually because of that, that is amazing in the sense that give you the possibility as a volunteer to learn
La
a lot.
oportunidad como voluntaria de aprender muchísimo, de aprender de cada de estas tareas tan diversas. Como ha mencionado en la introducción, es como una escuela de derechos humanos. Entonces, es un trabajo tan colaborativo.
Very important and very like it was a learning during my time in Mexico, and you never like, because not only because you don't never get bored because always the work changes, but because you can learn and also share about the things that you know. And working and living in the same place, of course, is very challenging and is like something that you need to, you know, take in account when you work in PVI. But probably like field work was the thing that changed my expectations when I arrived. Like because I mean, you have like an idea of what can be like working there, but actually like doing the work there and also doing field work, it was very like one of the most important learnings that I had there. I was in the northern, yeah.
Thank you. And if I go back to Mirtala, you mentioned some of the things that PBI's accompaniment has meant to you. And as I was saying at the start, that accompaniment is partly about bringing international solidarity to local struggles and movements like yours. I just wondered if you could tell us in a bit more detail about how this model of accompaniment by PBI has helped you to meet and maybe overcome some of the challenges that you and other human rights defenders face in Guatemala.
Bueno, nosotros desde que emprendimos esta lucha hemos recibido muchas formas de represión. La manera que hemos utilizado, cuando mi padre estaba vivo, yo le decía, papá, le comentaba a él, y lo primero que decía, bueno, voy a brigadas, le decía, porque para mí no hay otra solución. Les voy a ir a comentar, y venir aquí a brigadas representaba para mí tomar fuerza, tomar impulso y poder afrontar con valor pues la situación que se estaba viviendo. Aquí en Guatemala se han vivido tiempos de militarismo y a partir de 2006 se empezaron a dar asesinatos y fuertes cosas contra parlamentarios, quemaron a unos parlamentarios, se llevó a cabo la entrada de la CICIG y ahí se vinieron dando cosas y situaciones más fuertes, pero PBI ha dado este acompañamiento antes, después y ahora, y las situaciones siguen siendo igual de fuertes, porque en 2017 quemaron a las niñas.
All this time in 2017, that PBI was still here. And so if they hadn't have been able to be there, they've always accompanied us, even if we've not overcome the repressions, but they've been there every step of the way to help.
Y nos han podido acompañar de una manera libre, permitiéndonos actuar como defensores de derechos humanos sin ningún intervencionismo y tratando de hacernos sentir que están con nosotros y que no estamos solos, ¿verdad? Yo creo que esa es la parte más importante para nosotros porque sabemos que contamos con alguien que hace una labor en favor de los defensores de derechos humanos.
Thank you, Mirtala. And you've mentioned just how difficult the situation continues to be in Guatemala in terms of the militarization of society, in terms of the threats to democracy, and in terms of the threats to social movements. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you and your colleagues have managed to achieve in spite of that pressure. What do you see as the achievements of civil society in Guatemala over the years, despite the amazing and enormous pressure that you've been under? If you could just share a little bit about your experience, about some of the successes and wins that you've managed to achieve in spite of that pressure.
Lo que sucede es que el trabajo se ha hecho firme, continuo y siempre sin abandonar la lucha que se tiene, y eso ha permitido que las personas que antes no ponían la atención sobre estos hechos hayan tomado más compromiso, se hayan involucrado, y hoy en día ese es el motivo de lo que estamos viviendo hoy en día. Ha habido una manifestación de los pueblos originarios. Los pueblos originarios han tenido el respaldo en muchas luchas de brigadas de paz internacionales, y los pueblos originarios hoy en día están trayendo a la ciudad la lucha de peleas justas sobre la democracia de nuestro país, y estas son respaldadas por la lucha que ha llevado PBI durante mucho tiempo en las comunidades, en lugares en donde se están desapareciendo defensores, asesinando, y donde cualquiera es criminalizado. La muestra de eso se está viendo al día de hoy aquí en Guatemala. Y PBI ha hecho una lucha que ha sido constante y que no se ha detenido durante todo este tiempo, a lo cual nosotros estamos agradecidos y creemos que es una luz dentro de toda esta oscuridad. Gracias.
Thank you, Mirtala. And yeah, I think I mentioned in the film about some of the indigenous women that we work with in Mexico, and those struggles that ultimately they won in terms of some degree of justice, accountability, and changes to the laws in Mexico were decades-long struggles. And I think that's something that sometimes isn't clear from the outside, is just how long and arduous these struggles are, and how incredible it is that people like you and the human rights defenders that inspire us continue to struggle over those years despite those pressures, because it's the only way to ultimately win. And we had two of your colleagues from indigenous communities in Guatemala visit us in London just a few weeks ago, and they were talking about the threats to democracy and the marches in the country to try and prevent some of the threats to democracy at the moment and protect indigenous land rights despite the pressure of transnational companies and other threats. I'd like to go back to you now, Laura. I think you said you were working in the north of Mexico. I wonder if you could describe a particularly memorable experience or situation that you experienced during your time as a PBI volunteer that you think kind of exemplifies the essence of that really varied work that you said you did whilst you were in the country.
Can you hear me? Yeah, right. Yeah, okay. Perfect. Thank you, Ben. I will say I was thinking about one time that we have this emergency situation, because in PBI, one of the tasks that you have to do is like respond to emergencies. We received this call like in the middle of the night, was like 2 a.m. in the morning. And it was a human rights defender calling us because someone, one person from an indigenous community that they accompany was missing, and they start like receiving a lot of calls, very strange, that appear to be threats. So we activate all the emergency response, and suddenly this human rights defender with other two women from the organizations like ring the bell in our house. So we were surprised, because these were like not normally the procedure that we usually did. Like they call you and you activate and you try to solve the problems and find the normal the response. But they arrived there and they were with us during the activation and during all these responses. And at the end, they said to us that they decide to go to the PBI house, not because they thought that that was gonna be helpful for the response, because they have the information that they already tell us by phone, but because they think that our house was safe and they feel supported to be with us at that moment. So we were like 3 a.m. in the morning with them, waiting for the authorities to give us more information. At the end, the person appeared, and it was just like an emergency that ends well. This time, other times doesn't end well. But yeah, for me, that is like the essence of PBI work. Like we are there like to support, to accompany, even in this like very simple things, just sharing a tea 3 a.m. in the morning when an emergency happens. Yeah, I would say that.
Thanks a lot for sharing that, Laura. And yeah, I think it's worth people knowing that a lot of the time when you're out, you can be reacting to emergencies and be under quite a lot of pressure, and often that pressure all comes at the same time, as is typical in life. So thanks for sharing that. Just to say to the people who've joined, this is the last chance to ask any questions that you have. If you have any questions for any of the people who've made interventions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom, and my colleague Christina is going to try and group them into a few questions for the panelists. Just before we do open for questions and answers then, Laura, I wondered what you would say for individuals, perhaps people who are on this call who are thinking of volunteering with PBI. I wonder what your top 3 tips would be for how to prepare for the challenges and the responsibilities that come with the role of being a protective accompaniment volunteer at PBI.
Well, I will say think very carefully about the decision. I mean, it's just 1 year that you decide to stop your life. I mean, not to stop it, but I mean, you change place of living, you decide to go and work with other people in a different place. So for me, it's a very important decisions, and our daily life can be, kind of change. So you need to be very open and very aware that this is what you want and you are committed to work in these things. And also talking to other ex-volunteers, for example, is very helpful to actually know how the work is and if this suits with you, with your expectations, with your mind, body and heart. It's very emotional process. So yeah. And also will say that be open to diversity and to the unexpected, not just because you work with people on other parts of the world, but because you are gonna live and work in a different place. And for me, it's very important to arrive to the place to thinking what this place is gonna teach me, how can I, learn from this place, from the people that are here, and actually use that as enrich your experience. And because if you arrive thinking that this is not my home, why things here are like that and not back home. So yeah, it's being open to learn, and also learn about the history and the people to understand the importance of the work that you are doing there. And I will say that I don't know if it's an advice, but like also a learning that I reflect after finishing my period at PBI is that like all the knowledge is valid. You know, like we came from a lot of backgrounds in our countries, in the organization that we used to work. I had colleagues from academia, activism, you know, international organizations, doing any other kind of jobs. And we arrived there with our backgrounds, but it's learning that everything it's valid, and also learning that we are not there to propose like the truth or solutions, that the people there is the people there is the people that already know that they've been there for a lot of time, like facing injustice, working a lot. And it's when you hear this that we give voice to them, no, they already have voice and very strong voices, you know, and a lot of things. So we just accompany them and amplify them. And also, like, for example, in my experience, that we used to work with an organization that works with indigenous people, like time, for example, like perception of time, how they understand time. And it was very challenging in the way that we normally in our Western mindset do things. So like, yeah, for me, it's like, don't forget that all the knowledge is valid and we can learn through each other. And it's very like, you know, in a participatory way that PBI works. So yeah, I will say that.
Fantastic, thank you. Really insightful, and yeah, I think accompaniment is the word. It's about accompanying those local struggles, and like you say, making sure that those voices that are really loud can continue to be heard and echoed, but in safety and with solidarity as well. I'm going to hand over to Christina, my colleague, who's been trying to group some of your questions so that we can put them to the panel. So over to you, Christina.
Super, thanks, Ben, and many thanks to all of our panelists who have really, I think everyone can say it's been really interesting to hear everyone's experiences. We might just start off with a couple of questions. Firstly, Ben, if you can explain, how does the work of PBI in the UK feed into the work done by PBI protecting human rights defenders, for example, in Guatemala and Mexico? And how else can I help PBI's work if I'm not able to be a volunteer at the moment?
Okay. Hold on. It's telling me to unmute, but you can hear me, right? Okay, good. So how does PBI's UK work feed into the international work? So I guess in the UK, we are doing hopefully at least 3 things to try and support the kind of work that Mirtala and Laura have talked about that goes on in Guatemala and Mexico, which is where we're directly accompanying and supporting and trying to provide protection to human rights defenders. The first thing is part of our job is to get resources out to those frontline teams, like the one that Laura was working in and the one that accompanies Mirtala. That means events like this, trying to encourage people to sign up to volunteer for PBI. It also means fundraising, trying to get resources to those frontline teams so that the volunteers are trained, housed, supported, so that they can get around countries. Mexico is an enormous country. It's not cheap to get around, so that they can do all of the work that they do. So the first thing is getting resources out there. The second thing is making sure that we get support from the UK to the human rights defenders that we work with around the world. That support can come from multiple places. So when Lesbia and Sandra, the defenders from Guatemala, came over recently, that was because they wanted legal support from international lawyers. And so we pulled together a delegation of lawyers from multiple countries, including the UK, Brazil, Colombia, and elsewhere, to go to Guatemala on a fact-finding mission. It might mean legal support, but it might mean political support. Part of our job is to lobby the UK government so that it does more to support defenders at risk, so that its embassies do more to support defenders at risk. And part of it is to activate solidarity networks, NGOs, and others who can take action to support human rights defenders, not least when they face emergencies like the ones that Laura mentioned. And sometimes when those activations, which is the PBI terminology, happens, we get alerts asking us to take action in the UK, which is part of global action, which makes sure that the perpetrators in somewhere like Mexico or wherever it might be know that there's international attention and there'll be an international consequence. The third thing we also do is we do advocacy in the UK to try and get the UK government to change its policies so that it does more to support defenders and more to regulate the behavior of UK companies around the world, because a lot of the people that we're working with are not just coming up against state abuses but also corporate abuses. If you can't sign up to volunteer in the field, there are a number of things you can do. You can volunteer in our UK office. You can sign up to our mailing list where we send actions where you can help put pressure on MPs and others to take action in support of human rights defenders. You can donate to PBI, and there are other things that you can do, which you'll find out about through the newsletter. So I'd encourage you to sign up to that.
Super. Thank you, Ben. Then we have a question maybe I can put to Mirtala, and then a question for Laura also. Maybe firstly, Mirtala, if you could answer, how do you and other human rights defenders manage the emotional and psychological toll of your work? And can you share any strategies with us or practices that help you stay resilient and motivated in the face of adversity? And maybe Laura, I'll also read the question for you before Mirtala answers. But similarly, how have you navigated the emotional challenges and found resilience in the midst of your work that you undertook as a volunteer with PBI? And have there been any lasting effects on your personal and professional life as a result of your experience? So Mirtala, firstly, if we could have your response.
Bueno, yo creo que es muy importante.
Very important that during the struggle that we're engaged in, that we are working slowly and always to deal with a situation of pain, of suffering, that we will carry with us forever until our last days. The way in which we see this, the way that we deal with this is that we are aware that we're not alone. In our country, we're not alone. There's lots of suffering, children who live in the streets, people who don't have a home. For example, yesterday in Guatemala, there was a landslide, and a family has disappeared as a result of the landslide. So there are things that happen every day. You go out on the streets in Guatemala and you see suffering all around you. And when we have an indolent government, a government like the one that we have that doesn't react in favor of the population, that actually contributes to all of these catastrophes and human tragedies that we experience in the country, that doesn't care about all of the suffering. So it's this understanding that suffering isn't just your own, that suffering is something which is collective, which is felt by an entire people. And this means that the sense that we have of sharing our suffering with lots of other people gives us a great strength. But living in among all of this pain, we are also aware that suffering may be even worse in other parts of the world, and that
son niños, mujeres y ancianos, ¿verdad? Entonces la comprensión de esto nos hace ver y agarrar valor y fuerza, ¿verdad? Y otra cosa que he hecho personalmente es agradecer por lo que tengo y dedicarme a sembrar. La siembra me libera, me quita el enojo, la rabia, el dolor, me alimenta. Y el poder hablar con personas que están padeciendo en nuestro país y ver su actitud tan positiva ante una situación de vida muy precaria es algo que me enseña y me da un rumbo a seguir. Esa es la situación que mantenemos y que pedimos a la creación, a la vida, a la madre tierra, que nos dé fuerzas, ¿verdad? Hasta el final. Eso es lo que nos mantiene.
Super. Muchísimas gracias, Mirtala. Thank you so much, Mirtala. I think that was a really, very powerful question, but even a very powerful response as well. Really, thank you very much. Laura, if you would like me to repeat the question that we had for you, do let me know, but I would
No.
then have you also to respond to that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Well, I think that Mirtala already kept saying better than me, but the reality that I was in Mexico, but it's like we share the same problems in all the region. So sometimes during the volunteering in PBI, that could be very painful, and very hard, like because the situation could be very hopeless. You find yourself in situation that you don't know what else you can do. But I think it's through relationships, and it's basically like seeing and being with people around you, not just in the PBI team, but mainly human rights defenders as Mirtala and a lot of human rights defenders in the region, that they give you like the strength to continue to find the importance to do this work, of course. And in my personal experience, I find that PBI for me was like a space for action. So in moments that you don't find hope, you don't know like how to continue because you feel powerless, I think it's people who gives you the strength to continue. And also like it's not a lonely journey. It's very like through the people which you talk to and with you share how you feel and the challenges that we faced, that you continue doing this. So yeah, I will say that like mainly it's people who gives you the power. And the other, you asked me about effects, right? In after, okay, yeah,
Exactly.
I think. Okay, I'm still processing. I left PBI at the beginning of this year, and even if it's just 12 months, it's like you live like 5 years in just 1 year. So it's like I still processing this experience. But I will say that, as I mentioned before, like PBI for me was a space for action, that I find in PBI a place where I can, work for work a little bit to face the injustice that my region is facing. And then I decided to go back to school. That of course was very hard decision, in the sense that living, you at the end you leave and the people stay. So this is always a hard situation. And but here I'm studying like in international peace studies, so like having this experience in PBI allowed me to put into practice, like seeing theory from another perspective. And so definitely for me that changed the way that I think about my personal and professional path, like my year in PBI. And I found that I want to continue working for human rights. So of course, every experience is very different. Like every volunteer decide to live this in a different way. But yeah, and the effects, about more like talking in an emotional perspective, I will say that you live a lot of things in this year, not just because the reality and like you work with very hard topics. Um, and that can continue reappearing, no, in the after you left the PBI house, as we call it. But in my case, like I continue involved in this topic, so for me it's like kind of healing, like continue working on this and trying to rebuild other spaces where I can like do this work. So yeah, I will say that. I don't know if I answer what you asked me.
No, super. I think that's also really useful to know from a previous volunteer's perspective. So thank you so much, Laura. Ben, I can hand back to you now. Thank you for all the questions in the Q&A, and I'm sorry we didn't get to answer them all in such a short time, but thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Christina, and thanks to everyone who put questions in the chat, and feel free to follow up with us if you have more. So just to finish up, I guess, in terms of how you can help, and I know some of the questions were about what's the process to become a volunteer with PBI in our frontline projects. That depends. So at the moment, we have teams in several countries in Latin America, teams in Kenya, in Nepal and Indonesia as well, although they work with ever slightly different models of accompaniment. And usually you apply directly to one of those teams. So you apply to the Mexico team, or you apply to the Guatemala team, or you apply to the Indonesia team, for example. Right now, there is a recruitment window open.
Convocatoria abierta para ser voluntario.
By Guatemala. Katya's put that information on the chat, and we will email it to all of you as well. So if you're keen to get started, that's the place that you can apply to right now. However, we're expecting there to be windows to apply to our projects in Honduras and Mexico and elsewhere over the coming months. To apply to the teams in Latin America, you need to speak Spanish. It doesn't need to be absolutely perfect when you apply. Mine certainly wasn't, but it will need to be good enough by the time you get out there. But that's by the time you've gone through the recruitment process and the training process. The recruitment process looks like a lot of recruitment processes. It's written at first, then there'll be an interview, and then you do some training, which is sometimes in person and sometimes remote, where you'll do some reading, you'll do some sessions, but you'll also do some practical exercises, and that training will continue once you've gone out to the country that you'll be a field volunteer in. Almost all of our projects, our teams ask you to dedicate at least 12 months to PBI. There are some exceptions to that, to do longer or shorter stints, but it tends to be a 1-year affair where you won't get paid a salary, but all of your costs will be covered, including your healthcare, and you'll get stipends to be able to take a break when you need to. So the best way, if you're keen right now, is to sign up to work with PBI Guatemala as a volunteer. We're going to send an email to all of you on Monday, which will also give you an opportunity to opt into future emails, through which we'll tell you about future opportunities. We need to have your permission to be able to do that. So please, if you want to receive those emails, reply on Monday. It can be as simple as saying, yes, please, or I opt in. But from then on, we'll be able to email you when other teams of PBI open to applications to be field volunteers. And we can also email you about opportunities to volunteer in our UK office and elsewhere. We'll also put in that a job opportunity. Our Indonesia team are also recruiting at the moment, but not for volunteers, but for a paid staff member. So we'll put that in the email as well. I would also encourage you all to sign up to our general mailing list as well. So if you sign up to that, you'll get information about future events in person and online, opportunities to lobby your MPs to support the defenders that we support, and to take other actions to support human rights defenders at risk. So please sign up to our general mailing list. There'll be a link in the email we send around, and Katya, my colleague, has put it in the chat as well. Please do share the video. The video is live. The film's up on YouTube, and we'll be sharing it on our social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, and we intend to get busier on Instagram. You can find us there at PBI UK, and please share the video widely. We really depend on people signing up to be volunteers for PBI, and this is a great way of letting them know what that looks like and encouraging them to do so. So please share it far and wide. And the final thing I would say is that if you're able to, we're doing a fundraiser next week. It's called The Big Give, and it's a great one because for every £1 that you donate, we get 2. That's my favorite kind of fundraiser. So and every little does help. We've got a target, pretty high target of £14,000. We're ambitious this year, but that's because I saw somebody on the chat asking about human rights defenders getting linked to other human rights defenders. That's something that PBI wants to do more of, is to facilitate exchanges between defenders that we work with, for example, in Africa and Asia, with defenders that we work with in Latin America, because they've so many experiences to share with one another. We also really want to push around the UK general election so that whoever gets into power does a lot more than the last government has on human rights. And most importantly, we need resources to get field volunteers on the ground and accompanying human rights defenders. So please keep an eye out for our big give next week. We'll put the link in the email too, and anything you can give will be gratefully received and put to good use. Final thing is to say thank you, I guess. Huge thank you to Mirtala in particular for joining us from Guatemala, for giving up your time and for sharing your experience, especially around these dates. We really appreciate it, and really inspired by your words. And the bad thing about doing this in a webinar format is that you can't see all of the people that have logged in. That's partly because we want to be able to record the event without that being a problem for anybody. But there were 42 people logged in from all around the world, and I hope that you can feel that solidarity even though you can't see it. Thanks a lot to you, Laura, for sharing your experiences and your stories. All the best with your studies. Thanks to Charlotte, thanks to Helen for the wonderful film. I'm really glad that we got to launch it with you this evening. Thanks to Christina. Thank you to Sandra and James for the interpretation. They're a huge part of PBI when we're working in such a multicultural, multilingual team. And yeah, a huge thank you to Katya and Ella, my colleagues who you can't see, but who put in a heck of a lot of work to pull this event together. So most importantly, thanks to all of you for tuning in, and I hope we can stay in touch, and I hope to see some of you out accompanying human rights defenders around the world soon. So thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Gracias, Mirtala. Thanks, Katya.
Thank you, everyone.
Gracias a ustedes. Muy amables, gracias. Y lindo video, precioso.
Después te lo mando el video y también el video del evento de hoy.
Gracias. Muy agradecida con todos. Gracias a PBI.
Fuerte abrazo.
Gracias a ustedes, igualmente. Sí. Yo digo que sí.
Muchísimas gracias otra vez.